The frost clung to the stone walls of Ashworth Castle like a second skin, relentless and unforgiving, as the winter of 1400 settled over the northern counties of England with a severity that seemed almost personal. Inside the great hall, where tapestries depicting hunts and battles hung heavy with age and dust, Lady Eleanor Ashworth stood by the window, her breath forming small clouds against the cold glass that had been imported at great expense from Venice 3 generations prior. She was 30 years old. In the currency of noble marriages, she was bankrupt. The fire crackled behind her, tended by a servant who moved with the practiced invisibility of those born to service, but Eleanor did not turn toward its warmth. Instead, she watched the courtyard below, where a rider was dismounting, his cloak heavy with snow, his movements stiff from what must have been hours in the saddle. Another messenger. Another rejection, perhaps, wrapped in the courteous language of diplomacy that meant nothing and everything at once. Her hand rose to touch the cold glass, and she noticed, not for the first time, the fine lines that had begun to trace themselves around her eyes. 30 years. In the villages, women her age had buried husbands and raised children to working age. In the convents, women her age had risen to positions of authority, their wisdom valued, their counsel sought. But in the marriage market of English nobility, women her age were whispered about in corridors and pitied in parlors. Too old, they said, though never to her face. Past her bloom, they murmured behind fans that cost more than a peasant's yearly earnings. A shame, they sighed, as though she were already dead. Eleanor had heard every variation of these judgments, carried to her by well-meaning relatives and less well-meaning rivals. She had learned to receive them with the composure expected of her station, her face a mask of pleasant indifference that had taken years to perfect. But alone, in moments like this, with only the frost and the fire as witnesses, she allowed herself to feel the weight of what those words truly meant. She was the only daughter of the late Duke of Ashworth, a man whose political miscalculations had left his family wealthy in land, but poor in alliances. Her mother had died bringing her into the world, a fact that Eleanor had carried like a stone in her chest for as long as she could remember. Her father had never remarried, had never produced an heir, and had spent his final years in a fog of grief and wine that had done nothing to secure his daughter's future. When he died, 3 years ago, Eleanor had inherited everything: the castle, the lands, the tenants, the debts, both financial and political. She had also inherited the title of Duchess in her own right, a rare and precarious position that made her simultaneously powerful and vulnerable. She could not pass her title to a husband without the king's approval. She could not marry without considering the implications for every alliance her family had ever made or broken, and she could not remain unmarried forever without inviting the circling vultures who saw in her lands and her title an opportunity too rich to ignore. The door to the great hall opened, and Eleanor turned, composing her features into the pleasant neutrality that had become her default expression. It was Margaret, her lady-in-waiting, a woman of 45 who had served the Ashworth family since before Eleanor was born. Margaret's face was carefully blank, but Eleanor had known her long enough to read the subtle tension around her eyes, the way her hands clasped a little too tightly in front of her. "The messenger, my lady," Margaret said. "He brings word from Lord Pemberton." Eleanor felt something tighten in her chest, though she did not allow it to show. Lord Pemberton was 53 years old, twice widowed, and possessed of a fortune that had been built on wool and expanded through marriages to women who had not survived the bearing of his 7 children. He had expressed interest in Eleanor 6 months ago, and she had been negotiating, stalling, really, ever since. "And what does Lord Pemberton say?" Margaret's hesitation was answer enough. "He has reconsidered his position, my lady. His advisors have counseled him that a younger wife might be more suitable to his needs." The words hung in the cold air, each one a small blade. Eleanor absorbed them as she had absorbed so many others, letting them cut without allowing herself to bleed where anyone could see. "I see," she said, and her voice was steady. "Is that all?" "There is also a letter from your cousin, Lord Ashworth." Eleanor's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Her cousin William had inherited the secondary Ashworth title through a distant branch of the family, and he had spent the 3 years since her father's death making it abundantly clear that he believed the primary title and lands should have passed to him instead. He challenged nothing openly, he was not brave enough for that, but his letters were filled with subtle insinuations and less subtle offers to relieve her of the burden of managing the estate. "Burn it," Eleanor said. "My lady—" "Burn it, Margaret. I have no patience for his maneuvering today." Margaret nodded and withdrew, leaving Eleanor alone once more with the frost and the fire and the weight of her 30 years. She thought, as she often did in these moments, of the life she might have had. If her father had been more politically astute, if her mother had lived, if she had been born a son, or born to a lesser family where her age would have mattered less, if she had been willing to accept any of the dozen offers that had come in her 20th year, before the whispers had started, before particular had become difficult, had become too old. But she had not accepted them. She had waited, though for what, she could no longer clearly remember. Something more than transaction, something that felt like choice rather than surrender. And now she was 30, and the offers had dwindled to men like Lord Pemberton, and even they were finding reasons to look elsewhere. The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney, and Eleanor watched them rise and disappear into the darkness above. She did not know, I could not have known, that in a castle 3 days' ride to the south, a man she had not seen in 7 years was reading a letter that would change everything. She did not know that by spring, the frost would be gone, and with it, everything she had believed about her own story. She knew only that it was winter, and she was waiting, and she had been waiting for so long that she had almost forgotten what she was waiting for. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel. If stories of forgotten duchesses and secret hearts speak to something deep within you, then you belong here, where every tale is told with the reverence it deserves, and no soul is ever too old to find its home. 3 days' ride to the south, in the great stone fortress of Blackmore, Henry Ashworth, no relation to Eleanor's family despite the shared name, a coincidence of Norman ancestry that had confused heralds for generations, sat in his private study and read the letter for the 3rd time. The Duke of Blackmore was 34 years old, unmarried, and considered by the court to be one of the most eligible men in England. He was also considered, by those who knew him less well, to be cold, remote, and possibly incapable of the softer emotions that drove other men to marriage and folly. Those who knew him better, and there were very few who did, understood that his coldness was armor, his remoteness was caution, and his unmarried state was not incapability, but rather a wound that had never properly healed. The letter in his hands was from his mother, the Dowager Duchess, who had retired to a convent after his father's death, not out of religious devotion, but out of a desire to escape the court she had never loved. She wrote to him monthly, her letters filled with political observations and maternal concern in equal measure, and this one was no different in tone, but vastly different in content. "They say Lady Ashworth has been refused again," his mother wrote, her handwriting still elegant despite her 60 years. "Lord Pemberton this time, though I cannot imagine she would have accepted him regardless. She was always too intelligent for the fools who sought her hand, and now she pays the price that intelligent women always pay. She is alone, and they call her too old, as though wisdom were a defect." Henry set the letter down and stared at the fire. Eleanor Ashworth. He had not allowed himself to think of her, truly think of her, in 7 years. He had trained himself to redirect his thoughts when her image arose, to focus on ledgers or land disputes or the endless demands of his position. He had become so skilled at this redirection that he had almost convinced himself he had forgotten her entirely. But he had not forgotten. He remembered the summer of 1393, when he had been 27 and she had been 23, and their paths had crossed at a tournament held in honor of the king's birthday. He remembered the way she had stood apart from the other ladies, watching the jousting with an analytical eye rather than the performative terror or excitement that protocol demanded. He remembered approaching her, intending to make polite conversation, and finding himself instead in a debate about land management that had lasted 3 hours and ended only when her father had come to collect her. He remembered the months that followed, the letters they had exchanged, the careful dance of words that had said everything and nothing. He remembered the way her handwriting had looked on the page, precise and unhurried, each letter formed with intention. He remembered the way she had written about her tenants, her lands, her hopes for improvements that would benefit everyone under her family's care. He remembered thinking that he had never met anyone who saw the world the way he did, who understood that power was responsibility rather than privilege. He remembered the day her letters had stopped. He had learned later, through court gossip, that her father had discovered their correspondence and had forbidden its continuation. The old Duke of Ashworth had been in negotiations with another family, a match he considered more advantageous, and he had seen Henry's letters as an unwelcome complication. Eleanor had been given a choice, obey or be disowned, and she had chosen as daughters were expected to choose. Henry had not blamed her. He had understood even then that the constraints on women of their class were different from the constraints on men, more absolute and less forgiving. He had told himself that she would marry the man her father had chosen, and that he would wish her well from a distance, and that eventually the ache in his chest would fade into something manageable. But she had not married. The negotiations had fallen through. He had never learned why. And other negotiations had followed, and one by one they had all failed, and Eleanor had remained unmarried, and the years had passed, and Henry had buried himself in the duties of his duchy and told himself that what he had felt was a young man's infatuation, nothing more. His mother's letter made that lie impossible to sustain. "I wonder sometimes," the Dowager had written, "if you remember her. I remember the summer you returned from that tournament, and I remember the light in your eyes that I had never seen before and have never seen since. I did not speak then because I was a coward, and because your father would not have approved, and because I told myself that you were young and would find that light again with someone more politically suitable. But your father is dead, and I am old, and you are still alone, and I find that my cowardice has become too heavy to carry." Henry read those words again, feeling something shift in his chest, a tectonic movement of emotion that he had spent years trying to suppress. "She is at Ashworth Castle," his mother continued. "She has been there since her father's death, managing the estate alone, fending off vultures with nothing but her wit and her will. They say she is too old for marriage now, as though 30 years were a death sentence rather than a beginning. But you are 34, and no one says that of you. The world is unjust to women, my son, and it has been particularly unjust to her." The letter ended there without instruction or exhortation, but Henry understood what his mother was not saying. Go to her. It was madness. 7 years had passed. She might not remember him. She might have changed, or he might have changed, or the connection they had felt might have been nothing more than the illusion of youth. And even if none of that were true, there were political considerations, family alliances, the endless calculations that governed noble marriages. But Henry was tired. He was tired of calculations. He was tired of political considerations. He was tired of the parade of suitable young women who were presented to him each season, their faces blurring into a single expression of practiced charm and hidden ambition. He was tired of pretending that duty was enough, that responsibility could fill the hollow space where something else should have been. He rose from his chair and walked to the window, looking out at the snow-covered hills that surrounded Blackmore. The winter had been harsh this year, the roads difficult, travel inadvisable. A sensible man would wait until spring. But Henry had been sensible for 7 years, and all it had earned him was emptiness. He called for his steward. "Prepare a riding party," he said. "We leave for the north at dawn." The steward, a man who had served the Blackmore family for 30 years, did not ask questions. He merely bowed and withdrew, leaving Henry alone with his decision and the ghost of a woman he had never stopped loving. Eleanor was in the castle's small library, really just a room with 3 walls of books and 1 wall of windows overlooking the frozen garden, when the commotion began. She had been reviewing the accounts, a task she performed personally despite the presence of a competent steward, because she had learned early that trust was a luxury she could not afford. The numbers told a story of careful management and slow recovery, of debts being paid and improvements being made, of a household that functioned efficiently if not lavishly. She took satisfaction in these numbers, in the evidence of her own competence, even as she recognized that competence was not what the world valued in a woman. The sound of hoofbeats in the courtyard was not unusual. Messengers came regularly, merchants occasionally, and her cousin's spies more often than she would have liked. But the volume of the sound was unexpected. Not one horse, but many. Not a messenger, but a party. Eleanor set down her quill and rose, moving to the window with a deliberation that masked the sudden acceleration of her heart. What she saw made her stop breathing. A dozen riders were dismounting in the courtyard, their cloaks heavy with snow, their horses steaming in the cold air. But it was not the number of riders that arrested her attention, nor the quality of their mounts, nor the evident expense of their equipment. It was the banner they carried. Blackfield, Silver Stag, 3 stars above. Blackmore. The Duke of Blackmore was at her gate. Eleanor gripped the windowsill, her knuckles whitening against the cold stone, and watched as one of the riders removed his hood and looked up at the castle walls with an expression she could not read at this distance. But she did not need to read it. She knew that face. 7 years had passed, and he was older, and there was silver now at his temples where there had been only black before. But she knew him. She had dreamed of him in the months after her father's prohibition, dreams she had forced herself to forget upon waking. She had thought of him on her 30th birthday, alone in this very library, wondering if he had married, if he was happy, if he ever thought of the summer they had shared. And now he was here. She did not know what to feel. Shock, certainly, confusion, inevitably. But beneath those surface emotions, something else was stirring, something she had buried so deeply that she had almost forgotten its existence. Hope. She crushed it immediately. Hope was dangerous. Hope was what had kept her unmarried for a decade, waiting for something that made sense in her heart, even when it made no sense in the world. Hope was what the court laughed about when they discussed the Duchess of Ashworth, who had been too particular in her youth and was now too old for anyone to be particular about. She would not hope. But she would, she decided, change her dress before receiving him. 20 minutes later, Eleanor descended the main staircase of Ashworth Castle, wearing a gown of deep blue velvet that she had not worn in years. It was not her finest dress. She would not give him the satisfaction of thinking she had dressed for him. But it was becoming, and it reminded her of a time when she had still believed in possibilities. He was waiting in the great hall, standing by the fire where she had stood that morning, and when he turned at the sound of her footsteps, she saw something flash across his face before his expression settled into courtly neutrality. "Lady Ashworth," he said, and his voice was exactly as she remembered it, low and careful and carrying an undertone of warmth that most people never heard. "Forgive me for arriving unannounced." "Your Grace," she replied, and was proud that her voice did not tremble. "This is an unexpected honor." "To what do I owe the pleasure of your visit?" It was the correct response, the response protocol demanded, but she saw his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly, and she wondered if he was disappointed that she had not been more... What? Welcoming? Emotional? Honest? She had been honest once, in the letters they had exchanged, and it had cost her everything. "I was traveling north," he said, "and found myself near your lands. It seemed discourteous not to pay my respects." It was a lie, and they both knew it. Blackmore was 3 days' ride to the south. No route north would bring him near Ashworth unless he had chosen deliberately to make it so. But Eleanor played the game because it was the only game she knew. "You are most welcome," she said. "I hope you will stay and take refreshment. The roads are treacherous this time of year, and my household would be honored to offer you hospitality." "I would be grateful," he said, "if it is not too much trouble." "No trouble at all." They stood looking at each other across the great hall, the fire crackling between them, and Eleanor felt the weight of every word they were not saying pressing down on the air. She thought of the letters he had sent her, years ago, letters she had burned at her father's command, but had never forgotten. She thought of the way he had written about duty and honor, and the kind of love that was built on respect rather than passion. She thought of the last letter she had sent him, the one that had said nothing true because she could not risk her father's wrath, the one that had implied she had simply lost interest. She wondered if he had believed it. She wondered if he had hated her for it. She wondered why, after 7 years of silence, he was standing in her hall. The winter has been hard, she said, because silence was becoming unbearable. Yes, he agreed. The hardest in memory. I hope your journey was not too difficult. It was necessary. Something in the way he said the word made her breath catch. Necessary. Not pleasant, not easy, not advisable. Necessary. She looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time since she had entered the hall. His face was older, yes, carved by years and responsibility into something harder than she remembered, but his eyes were the same. Gray as winter sky, direct as a blade, and holding something that she recognized because she saw it every time she looked in a mirror. Loneliness. He was as alone as she was. The realization shifted something in her chest, a wall that she had spent years building beginning to crack. Perhaps, she said, and her voice was softer now, you would like to see the library. I remember you once said that a castle's library was the truest measure of its soul. His expression flickered. Surprise, recognition, something that might have been hope. You remember that? I remember everything, Your Grace. The words hung between them, more honest than anything else she had said, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. Then he smiled, just slightly, just enough to change the geometry of his face from stern to something almost warm. Then perhaps, he said, you might call me Henry, as you once did. Eleanor felt her heart beat once, twice, 3 times, loud enough that she was certain he must hear it. Perhaps, she said, in time. If you are feeling something stirring in your chest right now, if you recognize in Eleanor and Henry the particular ache of waiting, of wondering, of hoping against hope, then leave a comment saying, I believe in second chances. Let me know that you understand what it means to carry a love that the world says is too late, but that your heart knows is exactly on time. The library of Ashworth Castle was small by the standards of great houses, but it was Eleanor's sanctuary, and she found herself nervous as she led Henry through its doors. She had shown it to no one since her father's death, had not wanted to share it, had not trusted anyone enough to reveal how much it mattered. But she was showing it to him. She was not entirely certain why. The collection was started by my great-grandfather, she said, gesturing toward the shelves. He believed that knowledge was power, which was considered quite eccentric at the time. My grandfather added the natural histories, my father the legal texts, and I... She hesitated. You? Henry prompted. I have added what I could find of philosophy and poetry. It is considered even more eccentric for a woman to read such things, but I have never been particularly concerned with what is considered. He moved to one of the shelves, running his fingers along the spines of the books with a reverence that she recognized. Boethius, he said. The consolation of philosophy. I did not expect to find that here. It was my mother's, Eleanor said, surprising herself. She did not speak of her mother, ever, to anyone.
She died the day I was born, but she left behind a small collection of books that my father preserved. That was among them. Henry turned to look at her, and his expression was gentle in a way that made her throat tighten. I am sorry, he said. I did not know. Few people do. Few people ask. He nodded, accepting this, and returned his attention to the shelves.
But something had shifted in the room, some barrier had been lowered, and Eleanor found herself speaking before she had decided to speak. Why are you really here, Henry? The use of his name hung in the air between them. She had not meant to use it, had meant to maintain the distance of titles and formality, but it had slipped out, and she found that she did not regret it. He did not turn around. I received a letter from my mother, he said. She wrote of you, of your situation, of the way the court speaks about you as though 30 years of life were a crime rather than an achievement. Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks. Anger, she told herself, though it felt dangerously like something else. I do not need your pity, Your Grace. I know. Now he did turn, and his eyes met hers with an intensity that made her want to look away and also made it impossible to do so. I did not come out of pity, Eleanor. I came because my mother's letter made me see something I had been refusing to see for 7 years. She waited, not trusting herself to speak. I came because I never stopped thinking about you, because every woman I was introduced to was measured against a memory, and every one of them was found wanting. Because I have spent 7 years trying to forget that summer and failing, and I am tired of failing, and I am tired of pretending that duty alone is enough to sustain a life. Eleanor's hands were trembling. She clasped them together, hiding them in the folds of her skirt. You stopped writing, she said. I waited for your letters, and they stopped. Pain flickered across his face. You told me to stop. Your letter said that our correspondence had been a pleasant diversion, but that you had other matters to attend to. You wished me well in my future endeavors. Eleanor stared at him. I never wrote that. I have the letter still. I kept it, though I do not know why. Perhaps as a reminder of my own foolishness. I never wrote that, she repeated, her voice rising. My father discovered our correspondence. He was furious. He said that you were a distraction from a more suitable match he was arranging, that I had been childish and imprudent. He forbade me from writing to you again, and I obeyed because I had no choice. But I never sent you such a letter. She stopped, understanding dawning cold and terrible. Your father, Henry said slowly, must have written that letter himself, or had someone write it in a hand similar to yours. He was capable of it, Eleanor whispered. He was capable of many things in the name of ambition. But I did not know. I thought you had simply lost interest. When my letters went unanswered, I assumed that you had realized what everyone else realized, that I was too particular, too difficult, too what? His voice was rough. Too much, she said. I have always been too much of everything, too opinionated, too independent, too unwilling to perform the pleasant emptiness that men seem to prefer in their wives, too old now on top of everything else. Henry crossed the room in 3 strides and stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she could see the gray of his eyes was not uniform, but threaded with darker striations, like clouds carrying rain. You are not too much, he said. You are exactly enough. You are the only woman I have ever met who is exactly enough. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. Henry, I have wasted 7 years, he said, and his voice was fierce now, urgent in a way she had never heard. 7 years of believing that you did not want me. 7 years of trying to want someone else. 7 years of watching you from across crowded rooms and forcing myself not to approach because I thought my attentions were unwelcome. I will not waste another day. He took her hands in his and she did not pull away. I know that this is sudden, he said. I know that you have every reason to doubt me, to doubt this, to doubt everything. But I am asking you to give me a chance to prove that what I felt 7 years ago was not a young man's infatuation. It was the beginning of something real, something that has only grown stronger in the years I have tried to deny it. Eleanor looked at their joined hands, at the way his fingers wrapped around hers, strong and certain. What are you asking me? She whispered. I am asking for time, he said. A few weeks, perhaps a month here at Ashworth, where we can speak freely, away from the court and its whispers. I am asking for the chance to know you as you are now, not as the memory I have carried. And if, at the end of that time, you feel nothing, if 7 years have changed you or changed what was between us, I will leave and never trouble you again. And if they have not changed it? His smile was slow, transforming his face. Then I will ask you a different question, one that I should have asked 7 years ago, before your father's interference, before misunderstandings and silence and wasted time. Eleanor felt the crack in her wall widen, felt hope surge through the gap despite her best efforts to contain it. A month is a long time, she said. The roads will worsen before they improve. You may find yourself trapped here by the weather. I am counting on it. Despite everything, the years of disappointment, the armor she had built around her heart, the voice in her head that whispered she was a fool, Eleanor laughed. It was a sound she had not made in longer than she could remember, and the expression on Henry's face when he heard it was worth every moment of the loneliness that had preceded it. The first week of Henry's stay at Ashworth Castle passed like a dream that Eleanor was afraid to examine too closely, for fear it would dissolve upon waking. They fell into a rhythm with surprising ease, mornings spent separately, attending to their respective duties, for he had brought correspondence that required attention, and she had an estate to manage, and afternoons spent together in the library or walking the castle's frost-covered grounds. They talked about everything and nothing: the politics of the court, the challenges of land management, the books they had read and the ones they hoped to read, the small absurdities of noble life and the large injustices they both wished they could change. Eleanor found herself sharing things she had never shared with anyone: her fears about her cousin's machinations, her grief over her father's failures, her secret dreams of building a school on her lands where tenant children could learn to read. Henry listened with an attention that felt almost physical, as though her words were precious objects he was gathering and storing away. And when he spoke, she listened with equal attention, learning the contours of a man she had only glimpsed in letters years ago. She learned that his father had been cruel in ways that did not leave visible scars, that his mother had retreated to a convent not for God but for peace, that he had spent his entire adult life trying to be a different kind of lord than the one who had raised him. "I used to believe," he told her one afternoon, as they stood at the library window watching snow fall on the gardens, "that the highest virtue was control, that a man who controlled his emotions, his desires, his impulses, was a man worthy of respect. My father taught me that, not through instruction but through example, showing me the destruction that unchecked feeling could cause." He paused, and Eleanor waited. "But control without warmth is just another kind of cruelty," he continued. "I have spent years being controlled, being proper, being exactly what my position demanded. And I have been miserable. I have been so focused on not becoming my father that I forgot to become myself." Eleanor touched his arm, a gesture so small and so significant that they both felt the weight of it. "You are not your father," she said. "You could never be." He looked at her, and his eyes held something that made her heart ache. "How do you know?" "Because your father would never have ridden 3 days through a winter storm to see a woman the court considers too old to matter. Because your father would never have sat in this library listening to a woman's opinions about philosophy and land reform as though they were worth hearing. Because your father, from everything you have told me, never saw anyone as fully human except himself." She turned to face him fully. "You see me, Henry, not my title, not my lands, not my age, not my political usefulness or lack thereof. You see me, and that is something your father could never have done." He raised his hand to her face, his fingers tracing the curve of her cheek with a gentleness that contradicted every hard line of his appearance. "I have always seen you," he said. "From the first moment we met, when you were standing apart from the other ladies, watching the jousting with an expression of critical analysis rather than performative fear, I thought, there is a woman who thinks for herself, and I have been lost ever since." Eleanor closed her eyes, letting herself feel the warmth of his hand against her cold skin. "I was terrified," she admitted. "That day, when you approached me, I had been told my entire life that men wanted pleasantness, not opinions, that a woman who thought too much would die alone. And then you started talking about crop rotation of all things, and I found myself talking back, and I forgot to be afraid. I remember that conversation," he said. "I remember everything about that summer. I remember thinking that I had finally found someone who understood that caring about the lives of tenants was not weakness, but strength. That justice and kindness were not contradictions. That love and respect were the same thing, not opposites." He was so close now that she could feel the heat of him despite the cold room, could smell the clean scent of wool and wood smoke that clung to his clothes. "I should have fought for you," he said. "When the letters stopped, when I received that false dismissal, I should have come to Ashworth, demanded an audience, discovered the truth. Instead, I believed the worst. I told myself that a woman like you could never have truly cared for a man like me, and I ran away. You did not run away. You respected what you believed to be my wishes. I was a coward, You were 27 years old and alone, Eleanor said. As was I. We were both too young to know how to fight for what we wanted, and too constrained by our positions to try. But we are not young anymore. We are not constrained in the same ways. And we have a choice now that we did not have then. What choice? She opened her eyes and met his gaze. We can continue to let the past determine our future, or we can decide that the past is over, that the mistakes were made and cannot be unmade, but that the years ahead of us are ours to shape as we will. Henry's hand slid from her cheek to the back of her neck, his fingers tangling gently in the hair that had escaped her pins. I have already made my choice, he said. I made it the moment I read my mother's letter. The only question is whether you are willing to make the same one. Eleanor thought about the years she had spent alone, the suitors she had rejected, and the ones who had rejected her, the growing certainty that she would live and die in this castle with nothing but her books and her duties for company. She thought about the wall she had built around her heart, stone by stone, year by year, until it had seemed impenetrable. And she thought about how easily Henry had found the cracks in that wall, how naturally he had slipped through them, how right it felt to have him standing beside her. I am afraid, she admitted. So am I. I have been alone for so long. I do not know how to be anything else. We can learn together. She smiled, despite herself, despite everything. You always were better with words than I was. Only in letters. In person, I am famously tongue-tied. Ask anyone at court. Famously cold, they say. Remote. Unapproachable. All true, until now. He kissed her then, soft and questioning, and Eleanor felt the wall inside her crumble completely. The second week brought complications. It began with a letter from Eleanor's cousin William, delivered by a messenger who had braved the increasingly treacherous roads with suspicious determination. The letter was addressed to Eleanor, but its contents made clear that William knew of Henry's presence at Ashworth. Dearest cousin, the letter read, its courtesy barely masking its malice, I am surprised to hear that you are entertaining the Duke of Blackmore at our family's seat. Surprised and concerned. Surely you understand that such a prolonged visit without proper chaperonage may give rise to unfortunate rumors. As your closest male relative, I feel it my duty to offer my protection in this matter. I will arrive within the fortnight to ensure that all proprieties are observed. Eleanor read the letter aloud to Henry, her voice flat with barely controlled anger. He means to create a scandal, she said when she had finished. He hopes to compromise me, to use your presence here as evidence that I am unfit to hold my title. Henry's expression had gone cold in a way that reminded her of the rumors about him, the Duke of Blackmore, who showed no emotion, who could stare down a king without flinching. He will not succeed. You do not know William. He is clever in the way that rats are clever. He finds the smallest openings and exploits them. He has been waiting 3 years for me to make a mistake, any mistake, that he could use against me, and now I have given him one. You have given him nothing. I am a guest in your home, a friend of your family. There is nothing improper about my visit. We both know that is not how it will be portrayed. She walked to the window, looking out at the snow that had begun to fall again, heavier than before. I should not have invited you to stay, she said quietly. I should have received you with proper formality and sent you on your way. But I was selfish. I wanted this. Whatever this is. And now it may cost me everything. She heard him move behind her, felt his presence at her back like a warmth against the cold that seeped through the glass. Then let me give you something that William cannot take away. Eleanor turned to look at him. What do you mean? Marry me. The words hung in the air, solid and real and terrifying. Henry! I know it is too soon. I know we have only had 2 weeks, that we should court properly, that there are negotiations and contracts and all the endless formalities that noble marriages require. But I also know that I love you. I have loved you for 7 years, and I do not want to wait another 7 or another 7 days to make that love official. He took both her hands in his. Marry me, Eleanor. Not because of William, not because of scandal, not because you need protection, although I would protect you with my life. Marry me because I cannot imagine spending another day without knowing that you are mine and I am yours. Marry me because every moment we have already lost is a moment too many. Marry me because life is short and uncertain, and we have both wasted too much of it already. Eleanor's heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. I am 30 years old, she said, though she did not know why she said it. 30. Past childbearing, they say, past usefulness. Do you want children? I do not know. I had made peace with not having them. Then we will make peace with it together, or we will not, as we choose. I do not need an heir, Eleanor. I have cousins who can inherit Blackmore if necessary. What I need is you, only you. Whatever else comes or does not come is secondary. She was crying, she realized. Tears were sliding down her cheeks, and she could not remember the last time she had cried. I am difficult, she said through the tears. I am opinionated and stubborn, and I will argue with you constantly. I am counting on it. I am not beautiful. I am not young. I am not anything that a duke is supposed to want in a wife. You are everything I want. You are the only thing I have ever wanted. She laughed, a sound that was half sob, and buried her face in his chest. Yes, she said, the word muffled against his doublet. Yes, I will marry you. Yes. His arms came around her, holding her close, and Eleanor felt something she had not felt in so long that she had forgotten its name. Safety. She felt safe. They were married 3 days later, in the small chapel attached to Ashworth Castle, with Margaret as witness and the castle's elderly chaplain presiding. It was not the wedding Eleanor had once imagined, when she was young and foolish enough to imagine such things. There were no guests, no feasting, no elaborate gown or procession. She wore her blue velvet dress, the one she had put on the day Henry arrived, and he wore riding clothes because his formal attire had not survived the journey north in presentable condition. But when he spoke his vows, his voice steady and his eyes fixed on hers, Eleanor felt something she had never expected to feel. She felt chosen, not settled for, not compromised with, not accepted as a last resort when better options had failed. Chosen, deliberately, joyfully, completely. I, Henry, take thee, Eleanor, to be my wedded wife, he said, and each word fell like a stone into still water, sending ripples through everything she had believed about herself and her future. To have and to hold, from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death us do part. When it was her turn, her voice trembled, but she did not falter. I, Eleanor, take thee, Henry, to be my wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love, cherish, and obey, till death us do part. The chaplain pronounced them married, and Henry kissed her, soft and reverent, and Margaret wept quietly in the corner, and outside the chapel windows the snow continued to fall as though the world itself were being made new. William Ashworth arrived at Ashworth Castle 8 days after the wedding, his entourage reduced by the weather to a mere 4 men, his temper shortened by the difficult journey. Eleanor received him in the great hall, seated beside Henry, their hands intertwined in a display of unity that was both genuine and strategic. Cousin, William said, his smile not reaching his eyes. I see I am too late to offer my protection. Indeed, Eleanor replied, her voice pleasant and firm. Allow me to introduce my husband, Henry, Duke of Blackmore. We were married last week. She watched the calculation behind William's eyes, the rapid reassessment of his position. A duchess alone was vulnerable. A duchess married to one of the most powerful dukes in England was untouchable. My congratulations, William said, and the words sounded like they had been dragged from him by force. This is unexpected news. Love often is, Henry said, and his tone carried an edge that made William take an involuntary step backward. I trust you will share our happiness with the court upon your return." It was not a request. William stayed only one night, his excuse of treacherous roads suddenly less compelling than his desire to be elsewhere. When his party departed the next morning, Eleanor stood at the window of the great hall and watched until they disappeared over the horizon. "He will cause trouble," she said. "Let him try," Henry replied, coming to stand beside her. "He has no power now. You are Duchess of Ashworth in your own right and Duchess of Blackmore by marriage. There is no court in England that would hear his claims against us." Eleanor leaned into him, feeling the solid warmth of his presence. "I spent so long fighting alone," she said. "I had forgotten what it felt like to have someone stand beside me." He kissed the top of her head. "You will never fight alone again." Winter released its grip on the northern counties, slowly, reluctantly, as though it too were sorry to see this particular season end. Eleanor and Henry spent the remaining cold weeks learning each other, not just the surfaces they had discovered in letters and conversations, but the depths that only intimacy could reveal. They argued about philosophy and agreed about justice. They disagreed about the best methods of land management and found compromise in experimentation. They laughed at each other's weaknesses and admired each other's strengths. And in the quiet hours of the night, in the great bed that had been Eleanor's parents and their parents before them, they discovered that passion, like love, had no age limit. "They said I was too old," Eleanor whispered one night, lying in the circle of Henry's arms. "Too old for desire, too old to be desired." "They were fools," he replied. "You are not old, Eleanor. You are exactly the age you were meant to be, at exactly the moment you were meant to be here, with exactly the person you were meant to be with." She smiled in the darkness. "When did you become a poet?" "When I married a woman worth writing poetry about." Spring arrived in late March, announced by the sound of water dripping from eaves and the first tentative birdsong in the garden. The roads cleared, and with them came messages from the world beyond Ashworth's walls, letters of congratulation, some genuine and some transparently political, invitations to court which they politely declined, and a long, warm letter from Henry's mother, expressing joy that her son had finally found the happiness she had always wished for him. "She wants to meet you," Henry said, looking up from the letter. "She says she has been praying for this for 7 years. Your mother knew? All that time?" "My mother sees everything. She simply has the wisdom to wait until others are ready to see it too." The first day of true warmth found Eleanor in the garden, overseeing the planting of new roses that Henry had ordered sent from Blackmore's famous gardens. Her hands were dirty with soil, her hair escaping its pins, her face flushed with exertion and happiness. She was 30 years old, married, and more alive than she had ever been. Henry found her there, kneeling among the rose bushes, and stood for a moment simply watching her before she noticed his presence. "You look like a painting," he said when she finally looked up. "The Duchess in her garden. I would commission it, if I could capture this exact moment." Eleanor laughed and rose, brushing soil from her skirt. "The Duchess with dirt on her face, more likely." He crossed to her and touched her cheek, where a smudge of earth had indeed found its way. "Perfect," he said. "Absolutely perfect." They walked together through the garden, past the rose beds and the herb patches and the small fountain that Eleanor's grandmother had commissioned decades ago. The castle rose behind them, gray stone softened by morning light, and around them the world was coming back to life after winter's long sleep. "I have been thinking," Eleanor said, "about the school." "The one you dreamed of building? For the tenant children?" "Yes. I had abandoned the idea when I was alone. It seemed too ambitious, too costly, too likely to draw criticism from those who believe education is wasted on the poor. But now you have a husband who shares your views and a combined fortune that could build a dozen schools." She stopped walking and turned to face him. "You would support this? Truly?" "Eleanor, I would support anything that brings that light to your eyes. But more than that, I believe in this. I have seen what happens when tenants are educated, when they understand their rights and their possibilities. It does not breed rebellion as the fearful claim. It breeds loyalty and innovation and prosperity that benefits everyone. She felt tears threatening again, tears that came so much more easily now than they ever had before. I do not deserve you, she said. You have the equation backwards, my love. I do not deserve you. But I intend to spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of the gift I have been given. He took her hand and raised it to his lips. We will build your school, he said, and we will do everything else you have dreamed of doing, every improvement you imagined, every change you hoped to make. We have time, Eleanor. We have the rest of our lives. The rest of their lives. Eleanor had spent so long believing that her life was essentially over, that her best years were behind her, that everything ahead was merely endurance. And now here she was, standing in a garden, coming back to life, holding the hand of a man who had loved her for 7 years and would love her for 70 more if they were granted so much time. She was not too old. She was exactly old enough to know what mattered, what was real, what was worth fighting for. She was exactly old enough to appreciate the miracle of second chances, the grace of unexpected happiness, the profound gift of being truly seen and truly loved. Yes, she said, though he had not asked a question. Yes, to all of it. Yes, to the school and the reforms and whatever else we dream up together. Yes, to growing old with you and arguing with you and building something that will outlast us both. Yes. Henry smiled, and in his smile she saw the young man he had been at 27, and the man he was now at 34, and the man he would become in the years ahead. Then let us begin, he said. The school opened on a warm September morning, 1 year and 3 days after Henry had first ridden through the gates of Ashworth Castle. It was a small building, stone and timber, set on a piece of land between the castle and the village. Inside were 20 desks, a blackboard that had been specially made by a craftsman in London, and shelves lined with books that Eleanor had selected personally from her library and from new purchases made throughout the year. 23 children sat at those desks on opening day, the sons and daughters of farmers and craftsmen, children who had never held a book in their lives, children whose parents had wept with gratitude when they learned what the Duke and Duchess were offering. Eleanor stood at the front of the room, looking out at those small faces filled with curiosity and nervousness, and felt her heart expand with a joy so profound it almost hurt. Today, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the quiet room, we begin something new. Today, each of you takes the first step on a journey that will change your lives. Some of you will learn to read. Some will learn to write. Some will discover talents for numbers or music or art that you never knew you possessed. But all of you, every single one of you, will leave this room knowing more than you knew when you entered it. And that knowledge is something no one can ever take from you. She saw Henry standing at the back of the room, watching her with an expression of such pride and love that she had to look away or risk losing her composure entirely. Now, she said, turning to the blackboard, let us begin with the alphabet. The children leaned forward eagerly as she picked up the chalk. Outside, the September sun warmed the stone walls of Ashworth Castle, where Eleanor and Henry had made their home. Inside those walls, renovations were underway, improvements to the tenant cottages, modernization of the estate's agricultural practices, all the changes Eleanor had dreamed of for years and was now finally able to implement. William Ashworth had retreated to his own small estate, his schemes thwarted, his influence diminished. He sent occasional letters that Eleanor did not bother to read. He was no longer a threat, merely an annoyance, and she had more important things to think about. The Dowager Duchess of Blackmore had visited in the spring, spending a month at Ashworth and declaring it the most restful place she had ever known. She and Eleanor had spent hours talking, about books, about politics, about the son they both loved in different ways, and when she left, she had embraced Eleanor and called her daughter. The court had been scandalized briefly by the marriage. A duke choosing a woman of 30, a woman who had been rejected by half the nobility. But scandal, like winter, eventually passed, and now the Duke and Duchess of Blackmore were simply another couple at the edges of society, unremarkable in their happiness, notable only for their absence from the endless rounds of parties and intrigues that consumed everyone else. Eleanor preferred it that way. "They will talk about us someday," she told Henry that evening as they sat together in the library that had witnessed so much of their story. "They will say that you rescued me, that you saved the poor spinster Duchess from a life of loneliness." "And what will you say?" She smiled, reaching for his hand. "I will say that we rescued each other, that we were both lost in different ways, and that we found our way home together. I will say that love has no expiration date, that second chances are real, and that the best stories are the ones that almost did not happen." Henry raised her hand to his lips. "You have been my heart's secret," he said, "for 7 years. The thought I did not allow myself to think. The dream I did not permit myself to dream. And now you are my heart's truth. The first thing I see when I wake, and the last thing I hold when I sleep. The answer to every question I was afraid to ask." Eleanor leaned into him, feeling the steady beat of his heart against her cheek. "We have time," she said. "We have so much time." "Yes," he agreed, "we do." Outside, the stars appeared one by one in the darkening sky. Inside, the fire crackled softly, and two people who had waited so long to find each other sat together in perfect peace. The Duchess, who had been too old for every suitor, the Duke, who had loved her in secret for 7 years, and the truth they had finally spoken aloud, that some loves are worth waiting for, that some stories are worth believing in, and that it is never, never too late to begin again. And so, dear listener, we reach the end of Eleanor and Henry's story, a tale of patience and courage, of secrets held too long and truths finally spoken. If you watch this far, it is because you understand something that the world often forgets, that love does not expire, that hearts do not grow too old to hope, and that the best chapters of our lives can begin at any age. If this story touched you, leave a comment saying, "I watched this far so I can know who you are," the loyal souls who stayed until the very end, who believed in Eleanor when the court called her too old, who celebrated with her when happiness finally arrived. And if you have not yet subscribed to this channel, do so now, because stories like this one are waiting for you here. Tales of quiet courage and unexpected love, told with the reverence they deserve. Press the like button if Eleanor's journey moved you. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that their story is not over, that their best days may still be ahead, that being too old is a lie the world tells to those it has failed to understand. Until next time, dear friends. Until the next candle is lit, the next letter is opened, the next secret is finally spoken aloud. Thank you for listening. Thank you for believing. Thank you for being here.